On the morning of July 26, 1988, Annie Herron welcomed guests into her home in Jackson, Mississippi. They gathered to play bridge, just as they had done for decades. It seemed like an ordinary day. Nothing suggested that within a few hours, Annie would disappear forever. When her husband returned home that evening, Annie's car was still sitting in the driveway. Her purse was in the living room. Her glasses were nearby. Her shoes were still in the house. But Annie was gone. At first, it seemed strange. Then it became worrying. And then, investigators found blood, along with a bizarre note. A note that didn't ask for money. A note that listed 12 names instead of a ransom demand. Months later, the FBI would identify a suspect. Years later, a man would be convicted of conspiracy to kidnap Annie Herron. But even after the trial was over, the most important question remained unanswered. Because Annie Herron was never found. And to this day, no one knows what happened to her after she vanished from her own home in broad daylight. That morning, members of her bridge club gathered at her home. These weren't casual acquaintances. The same women had been meeting regularly for nearly 30 years. It was part of their routine, part of their lives. Guests began arriving around 10 o'clock in the morning. They played cards, talked, and spent the afternoon together like they had countless times before. No one noticed anything unusual. No one saw suspicious people nearby. No one heard threats. At around 2:30 in the afternoon, the last guest left the house. Not long afterward, Annie's housekeeper left as well. Before leaving, she spoke with Annie. Annie told her she planned to do some reading and wait for her husband to return home from work. Those would become the last known words Annie Herron ever spoke. No one would see her again. The next hour and a half remains one of the biggest mysteries in the case. What happened between 3 o'clock and 4:30 that afternoon? Who came to the house? And how could someone abduct a woman from one of Jackson's most prestigious neighborhoods without anyone noticing? To understand how unusual this crime was, you first have to understand who Annie was. She wasn't a random victim, and she certainly wasn't someone who could simply disappear without people noticing. Annie was born in Alabama and met Robert Herron while they were both students at the University of Alabama. She studied journalism and served as editor of the university newspaper. The two married in 1940. They would spend nearly 50 years together. Over time, Robert Herron became one of the wealthiest and most influential businessmen in Mississippi. After serving in World War II, he built a successful career in banking before moving into business ventures of his own. By 1988, his fortune was estimated to be worth somewhere between $100 and $200 million, an enormous amount of money for the time. But the Herrons were known for more than their wealth. They were heavily involved in philanthropy. They supported educational programs, cultural organizations, community projects. Annie herself worked with museums, arts organizations, and charitable causes. Friends described her as intelligent, kind, and deeply respected. But by the late 1980s, her health had begun to decline. She suffered from scoliosis, arthritis, and chronic intestinal disease. She relied on medication every day. Without it, serious complications could occur. Because of her health problems, Annie spent much of her time at home, which made one possibility seem highly unlikely from the very beginning. She had not simply walked away. And if she hadn't left voluntarily, then who took her and why? At around 4:30 that afternoon, Robert Herron returned home. At first glance, everything appeared normal. Annie's car was still parked in the driveway. The house was locked. Nothing suggested an emergency. But the house was empty. Robert initially assumed Annie might have gone to visit friends or family. As the hours passed, however, concern turned into alarm. By around 7:30 that evening, he began searching the house more carefully. What he found made no sense. Annie's purse was still there. Her glasses were nearby. Her shoes had been left behind as well. These were items she rarely went anywhere without. Yet now they had all been abandoned inside the house, as though she had expected to return in just a few minutes. Robert began calling relatives and friends. No one knew where Annie was. His son-in-law, Michael McCrae, joined the search. Together, they went through the house again. That was when they discovered something that would completely change the direction of the investigation. Near the front door was a folded note. It had been typed on a typewriter, almost as if it had been deliberately placed where someone would eventually find it. But what the note said was even stranger than the note itself, because the person responsible wasn't asking for money and wasn't explaining how Annie could be brought home. Instead, the note demanded something entirely different. When investigators examined the note, it quickly became clear that this wasn't a typical kidnapping. There was no ransom amount, no instructions for delivering money, no phone number, and no proof that Annie was still alive. Instead, the note was addressed directly to Robert Heron. It claimed that he needed to repay 12 people for everything they had lost through their involvement with school pictures. The writer demanded that each person be compensated for whatever losses they believed they had suffered, and if any of them had already died, the money should go to their children instead. After that came a list of names, 12 names, 12 men from different parts of the country. At first, the names meant nothing to investigators, but it didn't take long to discover a connection. Every person on the list had some connection to Robert Heron, and every one of them had been involved with school pictures. Years earlier, the company had filed lawsuits against 12 franchise owners. Those same names now appeared in the kidnapper's note. At first glance, the explanation seemed obvious. Someone wanted revenge. But the deeper investigators looked, the more problems they found. For one thing, the names were part of public court records. Anyone could have obtained them. One of the men had died years before Annie disappeared. Others had shown little or no interest in the company for a long time. And then there was the note itself. Something about it felt wrong, almost as if it had been written to push investigators in a specific direction. If the note was genuine, then revenge might have been the motive. But if it wasn't, then someone was deliberately creating a distraction. And while investigators struggled with that question, new evidence began to emerge. Inside the Heron home, investigators found blood. There were drops on the carpet. Additional traces were discovered near the front entrance. The blood type matched Annie's. Investigators believed she had been struck in the head before being taken from the house. That finding eliminated one possibility almost immediately. Annie had not left on her own. Meanwhile, detectives began interviewing neighbors. Several people reported seeing two unusual vehicles. One was a light-colored Ford pickup truck. The other was a white cargo van with Florida license plates. What made the van especially interesting was that it hadn't only been seen on the day Annie disappeared. Some neighbors recalled seeing it near the house weeks earlier, possibly even months earlier. That suggested something far more troubling. Someone may have been watching Annie long before she was abducted. But the most important development came several weeks later. Robert Heron received a letter. The moment he saw the handwriting, he recognized it. It belonged to Annie. The letter was dated August 10th. There was even a blood stain on the envelope. FBI experts later confirmed that Annie had written it herself. For the family, it was the first sign of hope. If the letter was genuine, Annie had survived the kidnapping, at least for a while. But the contents of the letter only deepened the mystery. Annie wrote that if Robert failed to meet the demands being made, she would be locked in a basement with only a few jugs of water. She pleaded for help. And that was essentially all. No instructions, no location, no explanation. Nothing that could tell investigators where she was being held. The letter confirmed that Annie was alive after the abduction, but it brought investigators no closer to finding her. Instead, it created even more questions. Where was she? Who was holding her? And if money was truly the motive, why was the kidnapper making everything more complicated instead of demanding payment? Despite the uncertainty, Robert Heron made a decision. If there was any chance that following the demands could bring Annie home, he was willing to do it. That decision would soon lead to one of the strangest chapters in the entire case. After receiving the letter, the Heron family faced an impossible choice. They still didn't fully understand what the kidnapper wanted, but if there was even the slightest chance Annie could be saved, they were willing to try. Robert instructed his attorneys to review old school pictures records. The goal was simple: determine how much money the people on the list believed they had lost. After consulting with law enforcement, an extraordinary decision was made. On August 16, 1988, Robert Heron sent checks to the individuals named in the note. The total amount came to nearly $1 million. For the family, this wasn't a business transaction. It wasn't a legal dispute. It was an attempt to save Annie. But something unexpected happened. Many of the recipients returned the money. Some openly stated they wanted nothing from Robert Heron. Others showed little interest in the payments at all. If the kidnapping had really been about compensation, the plan made very little sense. But if money wasn't the goal, then what was? Investigators once again turned their attention to the list of 12 names, and gradually, one name began to stand out: Newton Alfred Wynn, a 65-year-old attorney from Florida. Years earlier, Wynn had owned a school pictures franchise. The company later sued him. A court ordered him to pay more than $150,000. When he stopped making payments, the debt continued to grow. Eventually, it approached $500,000. But the conflict wasn't just about money. Court orders had allowed school pictures to seize some of Wynn's assets: investments, vehicles, property, jewelry. By the spring of 1988, he was close to losing his office. Only weeks later, Annie Heron disappeared. Was it a coincidence? Possibly, but new details were beginning to surface, and each of them pointed in the same direction. One of the earliest leads in the investigation was the white cargo van with Florida plates. Witnesses reported seeing it near the Heron home, not just on the day Annie vanished, but before that as well. At first, it seemed like a minor detail. Later, it became one of the most important pieces of the investigation. The FBI eventually learned that Wynn's associate, Don Ward, was listed as the owner of a white Dodge van, a van that closely matched the description provided by witnesses. The previous owner of the vehicle told investigators something interesting. According to him, Wynn had been the real buyer, and he had specifically asked that his own name not appear on the paperwork. Investigators then revisited earlier witness statements. What they found was troubling. Back in April of 1988, one neighbor noticed a man sitting in a white van near the Heron residence. Suspicious, he wrote down the license plate number. Later, investigators discovered that the plate had been stolen from another vehicle. When shown photographs, the witness identified Newton Wynn. Months later, another neighbor described a similar encounter. He approached a man sitting in a white van and asked whether he needed help. The man appeared irritated and replied, "Is there a law against parking in this neighborhood?" Then he drove away. That witness also identified Wynn. Soon, a third witness came forward, a construction worker who had been working near the Heron home the day before the kidnapping. He, too, reported seeing a man in a white van, and he, too, identified Wynn. At that point, investigators began considering a disturbing possibility. What if this wasn't a spontaneous crime? What if someone had spent months studying the Heron family, watching the house, learning their routines, waiting for the right moment? But even that was only the beginning, because the FBI was about to uncover evidence that would connect Wynn directly to Annie's letter, and that discovery would change everything. By late 1988, the FBI already had suspicions about Newton Wynn. But suspicion isn't evidence. Investigators needed something that could directly connect him to Annie's disappearance. And then something unexpected happened. After the case was featured on Unsolved Mysteries, a woman from Florida contacted investigators. Her name was Marilyn Taylor. Years earlier, she had been involved in a relationship with Wynn. What she told investigators would dramatically change the direction of the case. According to Taylor, shortly after Annie disappeared, Wynn contacted her and asked for a favor. But it wasn't an ordinary favor. They met early one morning outside a hotel in Florida. Before speaking, Wynn made sure no one was watching. Then he explained what he needed her to do. He wanted her to mail a letter, a very specific letter. He offered her money, but along with the money came a long list of instructions. Buy an airline ticket with cash. Use a false name. Fly to Atlanta. Change your appearance. Avoid drawing attention. Mail the letter from a busy post office. Then return to Florida through a different airport. It sounded less like a request and more like a covert operation, and the strange instructions didn't stop there. When Wynn handed her the envelope, he wore surgical gloves. The letter had been wrapped inside a linen napkin. He warned her not to open it, not even to touch its contents. After mailing it, she was supposed to destroy the wrapping. Taylor followed most of the instructions. She flew to Atlanta, used a false identity, changed her appearance, and mailed the letter. Only later did she realize what she had been carrying. When investigators showed her a photograph of the envelope Robert Heron had received, she immediately recognized it. It was the same letter, the letter written by Annie. The letter that had convinced everyone she was still alive after the kidnapping. For the first time, investigators had a direct connection between Wynn and one of the most important pieces of evidence in the case. But even more discoveries were waiting, and each one made the case against Wynn stronger. Following Marilyn Taylor's statement, investigators began re-examining everything they knew about Wynn. The picture that emerged was deeply troubling. Among his possessions were maps of Mississippi. One map showed the route to Jackson. Another had markings highlighting the street where the Herons lived. Several of Robert Heron's business locations were marked as well, almost as if someone had been gathering information about a target. But one of the strangest discoveries involved documents investigators found among Wynn's old papers. Years before Annie's disappearance, Wynn had discussed a plan involving the kidnapping and murder of Marilyn Taylor's former husband. The details were unsettling, because many of them resembled elements of the Heron case: surveillance, maps, stolen license plates, a typewriter, anonymous communications. Investigators believed they had found something resembling a blueprint, a plan that looked remarkably similar to what had happened in Jackson. At the same time, Wynn's alibi began to collapse. He had previously claimed that he spent the day of the kidnapping at a bar in Florida. His associate, Don Ward, supported that story. But later, Ward admitted something important. A few days after Annie disappeared, Wynn asked him to lie to investigators. The alibi had been fabricated. Then another detail emerged. After receiving one of Robert Heron's checks, Wynn allegedly told Ward, "That's not what I wanted." Investigators saw those words as potentially revealing. Perhaps money had never been the real objective. Perhaps the motive had always been revenge. Revenge against a man Wynn blamed for the destruction of his life. But one question still remained. If Wynn truly orchestrated the kidnapping, then where was Annie? And was she still alive after the letter was mailed? On March 11, 1989, the FBI arrested Newton Alfred Wynn. To many people, it looked like the end of the story. In reality, it was only the beginning. Investigators believed they had assembled a powerful case. Witnesses had placed Wynn near the Heron home. The white van connected him to the area. His former girlfriend linked him to Annie's letter. His alibi had fallen apart, and the documents found in his possession suggested planning and preparation. But there was a problem, a very serious problem. Investigators still didn't have Annie. They had no body, no confirmed location where she had been held, no confession, and no witness who could explain what happened after she was taken from her home. At trial, prosecutors argued that Wynn orchestrated the kidnapping as an act of revenge against Robert Heron. The defense argued the opposite. Wynn's attorneys claimed he had been framed. At one point, they even suggested a far more shocking possibility, that Robert Heron himself could somehow have been involved. But no evidence supporting that theory was ever presented. In February 1990, the jury reached its verdict. Newton Alfred Wynn was found guilty of conspiracy to kidnap, perjury, and extortion. He was later sentenced to nearly 20 years in prison. For investigators, it was a victory. But for Annie's family, it was something very different. Because the man they believed was responsible was behind bars, and Annie was still missing. In February 1990, Newton Alfred Wynne was found guilty of conspiring to kidnap Annie Heron. He was later sentenced to nearly 20 years in prison. For investigators, the case was all but closed. But for Annie's family, the hardest question remained unanswered. Where was she? Investigators believed Wynne had taken Annie to Florida after the abduction and that she may have died within the first month after disappearing. But they were never able to prove it. Her body was never found. The place where she was held was never found. And no evidence was ever discovered that could explain what happened after the letter mailed from Atlanta. In 1990, Robert Heron died. He never learned what became of his wife. A year later, Annie was officially declared dead. But even today, her case remains one of the strangest kidnapping investigations in American history. There is a convicted man. There is a motive. There is evidence. There is a guilty verdict. But there is no answer. On July 26, 1988, Annie Heron welcomed friends into her home. By evening, she was gone, and no one has ever seen her again. Decades have passed, yet the same question remains. What happened to Annie Heron after she disappeared from her own home?